Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's Knowledge Bank. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is being hosted by Denis Watling from ChargeGuru, and he is going to be speaking to you about navigating the OZEV shift. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get through as many as we can at the end. The webinar is also being recorded today and will be available to watch back via the News on the Block YouTube channel for anyone that would like to watch it again. I'm now going to hand you over to Denis to begin the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you to everyone who's joined today's webinar. Very pleased to be here and to provide an overview on what has changed from an OZEV, so Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, funding perspective. Funding that changed 1st of April this year, rather than just presenting the changes themselves, because I'm sure you guys are more than capable of going on Google and finding out those changes. What we want to do today is put it in the context of buildings, apartment buildings, and possibly office buildings as well, so that everyone on this webinar hopefully comes away from today's session with an understanding of how those changes have impacted the buildings that you own, manage, or are responsible for. So very quick overview on what we will go through today. So I will give you a very brief introduction to ChargeGuru. I'll then move on to a little bit of electric vehicle market context. So I think it's always important to start with the wider EV market and where the UK is in its electrification journey. And then the bulk of today's session will be focused on that OZEV shift. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we'll be touching on specific topics related to hopefully everyone on this call. So we'll be looking at funding options for EV charging solutions within apartment buildings. We'll also be looking at how the OZEV change potentially impacts insurance, fire safety, and maintenance considerations. And overall, we'll be summarising why that OZEV change matters to you as property experts, managers, owners. We'll also take a little bit of a look at timescales for projects, not necessarily directly linked to the OZEV change, but I think important to outline that. And as Vicky says, we'll have some time at the end for any questions. If it's okay with everyone, what I'll do is I'll save the questions till the end, but feel free to ask questions as we go through, and any that I don't think we've answered throughout the presentation, then I'll make sure we spend some time doing my best to answer those. So a very brief introduction to ChargeGuru. So and myself, I don't think I've introduced myself. So as Vicky said, my name is Denis Watling. I'm the Managing Director for ChargeGuru in the UK. But as you can see on the screen and the bottom right, we do operate in 6 markets across Europe. So we were founded in France about 12 years ago, and since then have expanded to the 6 countries, including the UK that you can see on your screen. And actually, the solution for EV charging that we specialise in is solutions for apartment and office buildings. So as you can see on the screen, we work with well over 1,000 property managers, freeholders, asset managers throughout Europe, and we've contracted with over 25,000 buildings. So the vast majority of those are apartment buildings, plus a few thousand office buildings. And as you can see in the top right, what that means is that throughout those 25,000 plus buildings, we have now enabled over 2 million tenants, whether that be residents in apartment buildings or commercial tenants within office buildings. We've enabled 2 million tenants to be EV ready within their parking situation. So that is all I'm going to say on ChargeGuru, but hopefully it gives you the context for why I think we're quite well positioned to give some information about the OZEV grant changes. So before we move on to what's changed and how it impacts everyone on the call today, as I mentioned, we just want to do a little bit of EV market context. So what's happening with electric vehicles in the UK? Well, PIV, so it stands for plug-in vehicles. We're including fully electric, battery electric vehicles, and also talking about plug-in hybrid vehicles in this number as well. So as of the end of April, there are over 3 million plug-in vehicles on UK roads, which equates to nearly 9% of all cars, all passenger cars currently on UK roads are electrified. And as you can see, 2/3 of those electrified vehicles are fully electric, so battery electric vehicles. You can see on the top right graph here, the dark blue is the dark blue bar is the number of battery electric vehicles, and the slightly lighter blue, the number of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. and the red line shows you the total market share, or sorry, not market share, the total vehicle park within the UK. So you can see here that significant increase over the past 3 to 4 years. And yeah, now almost 1 in 10 cars on UK roads are electrified. Just a point on the new car registrations information. So although 1 in 10 cars on UK roads are now electrified, actually 25%, so 1 in 4 new vehicle registrations year to date have been fully electric vehicles. So you can see that the increase in the number of electrified vehicles on UK roads will continue to be significant over the coming years. Important point in the middle of the screen, I'm sure everyone's aware, but just from a regulatory perspective, there is a ban on the sale of new ICE, so internal combustion engine vehicles, another name for petrol and diesel. So there is a ban on those vehicles from 2030, with only new battery electric, hybrid electric, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles allowed to be sold from 2030. And then from 2035, hybrid vehicles will no longer be able to be sold in the UK, so only fully electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles from 2035. So an important point, because again, it shows the direction of travel for electric vehicles in the UK. However, what I'd argue is even more important is the bottom point here. So cost parity is already here. So what we talk about there is, you can see we reference total cost of ownership, known as TCO. So this is the graph on the right, shows throughout Europe the cost per kilometre based on a 4-year, 120,000 kilometre vehicle life. So this is saying that not just the purchase price, but when you take into consideration the purchase price, depreciation, service, maintenance, repair, and of course cost to fuel that vehicle, so petrol, diesel, or electric, then you can see here that actually far right is us in the UK, and you can see that the green bar is a battery electric vehicle, and the yellow is an internal combustion engine vehicle. And when you take all of those things into account, the cost of owning and running an electric vehicle is already in line with owning and running an internal combustion engine vehicle. Interestingly, this graph from the right is almost 12 months old. I deliberately haven't updated it because this is probably the most extensive one out there. There will be new ones coming, but what's really important is since then, we've seen new electric vehicle manufacturers enter the UK market, specifically Chinese brands, which are driving the price, the sale price of those electric vehicles down. So actually, it's pretty reasonable to say that given the changes in market, so the introduction of cheaper electric vehicles, plus of course the geopolitical circumstances which have increased petrol and diesel costs, it's pretty fair to say that the cost of owning and running an electric vehicle is now less than owning and running an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the reason I say that is more important than the middle one, the 2030 ban, is because actually that's aside from all regulation. So the fact that the product itself, the electric vehicle itself, is now cheaper to own and run than an internal combustion engine vehicle means that actually there's only really one direction of travel for the market. So that's all very well and good, but why does that mean anything, or why is that interesting to everyone on the call? So I think the place to start here is the fact that electric vehicles are cheaper to run than ICE vehicles, as I just mentioned, but the cheapest place to charge that electric vehicle is at home. So you can see here, just using Zap map data, so a good company that kind of is completely in the middle of this environment, so independent in terms of the data they provide. But you can see here that actually just taking some different driver profiles, so a family that mostly charge at home does 80% of their charging at home. You can see an annual journey cost of less than £700. And if you go all the way to the right, Chris, as it says here, who does 80% of his charging on public slow chargers, and the remaining 20% on rapid chargers, so the likes that you see at service stations, petrol stations. You can see actually Chris's annual journey costs end up being more than an internal combustion engine driver. So the summary on the left-hand side here says, it can cost about £20 to fully charge a 300-mile EV at home, but that rises to £50, so 2.5 times the cost if you are entirely reliant on the public network. So of course, the reason that matters for everyone on this call is you clearly are responsible for managing or owning apartment buildings. so residents who live in apartment buildings. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that it's cheaper to charge, or cheapest to charge your vehicle at home? Well, actually, we can see that 74%, so almost 3/4 of apartment residents, actually consider EV charging in their home choice. You can see the breakdown on the left-hand side, and that will be predominantly for the reasons we just discussed, i.e. it's significantly cheaper to charge their vehicle at home than on the public network. So of course, it's a key consideration for them. If we just briefly touch on commercial buildings, actually 40% of tenants want green leases, and almost half of tenants say that EV chargers boost the location appeal, according to CBRE's survey a couple of years ago. So not just apartment buildings, but also in commercial office building settings as well. And in terms of why it matters, and perhaps why, hopefully why everyone is on this call and considering their options for EV charging within their apartment buildings that they own and manage, it's because, for the reasons we've just outlined in terms of the market context and the want and the desire for residents to have EV charging, it's the possibility to add value to your building now by being EV ready, and equally as important, by being proactive today, when as we said, almost 1 in 10 cars UK road are already electric vehicles, so you're not going too early, and there's still a significant number of electric vehicles already on the road. But by being slightly proactive today, before it's perhaps a significant number of residents within your apartment building, you can avoid the hassle of dealing with, which I'm sure many of you are, dealing with regular requests from residents. But also there's always the possibility of regulation coming in the not too distant future. So some of you may be aware of the Part S planning regulations, which came into force a few years ago, which mandated the inclusion of electric vehicle charge point infrastructure in new build apartment buildings. So that is already in place and has been in place for a few years. There is no regulation around the retrofitting of EV charge points at the moment, but there is some significant lobbying going on from various parties to introduce a right to charge. So essentially enabling residents in apartment buildings that route to challenge their freeholder, property manager, and to enable them to charge their vehicle. Now, that I'm not suggesting that's going to come in anytime soon, but I think it's just an important point that by being proactive today, you avoid that possible regulation further down the line. So hopefully that's why most people on this call, you understand and appreciate where the EV market is, and potentially how it impacts you. And possibly the reason you're also on this call is because you're fully aware that installing EV charging in multi-unit buildings, whether that be apartment or office buildings, presents some pretty unique challenges for everyone on this call. So the installation of EV and an EV charge point in a single home, semi-detached house with a driveway, is now pretty simple in the UK, which is great. So not super expensive, and also very simple to do. But when we come to multi-unit apartment or office buildings, there's some significant complications and challenges. To list a few here, so questions that you might ask yourself or that you might have from your residents. How do I manage as a property manager or owner? How do I manage, and who will pay for the electricity used by those chargers? Who should pay for the installation itself? What regulations apply, and what grants are available? So obviously in bold there, because we'll talk about the changes to the grants. And is there enough? Another common question: is there enough power to charge several vehicles at the same time? What are the power restraints of the building that you're discussing, or the portfolio that you're considering electrifying? So we'll cover some of those questions, or the answers to those questions, over the next 15 or 20 minutes. So in the context of the OZEV grant changes, and I appreciate I haven't told you what those are yet, that information is coming, I promise. But I think what's important before we get on to that is kind of choosing the right solution and which solutions exist. I will add quickly before I carry on that the format and the layout of these slides is very similar to a previous webinar that we've co-hosted with News on the Block, but I can assure you the content is different. So if you're looking at this thinking, I've seen this one before, I assure you haven't, because the changes only happened in April. So in terms of the right solution, which solutions exist, so broadly we can, from a kind of safety and grant perspective, we can split them into two different solution types, so ad hoc solutions and coordinated whole building solutions. So what we're talking about ad hoc solutions or reinstallations. generally or almost always a tenant-led. They're individual, separately managed installations, so individual residents choosing to install charge points within their allocated parking space, for example. And by the very virtue of the ad hoc nature, there's no building-wide or kind of infrastructure planning involved in that. It's very much an isolated installation for that individual charge point, which therefore means that those charge points, when installed, are on separate electrical networks. And by the virtue of all of those points, it means it's limited in its ability to scale, which we'll come on to in a moment, which is, of course, really important when we think about the context of the EV market, which we spoke about a moment ago, and how that continues to increase. Scalability is really important in this issue. So that's what we're talking about broadly when we talk about ad hoc installations. So when we talk about coordinated, of course, it's pretty much the opposite of that. So generally building-led installations that are coordinated and centrally managed from an installation perspective. So it includes infrastructure level planning and of course a building-wide electrical network rather than a single electrical network. Apologies, that shouldn't say single. Building-wide electrical network, and again, what that enables is a scalable solution as and when EVs continue to be increased in that car park. So that's the very quick overview of the two different solution types that we want to talk about and how it relates to the OZEV funding. Key considerations of the two different options in light of the OZEV funding changes. So first point, I suppose, is which type of solution should you as property experts be implementing in your building. So we would strongly recommend, and I suppose the reason we exist and the evidence and our experience over the last decade across those 6 markets, and I'll come on to the details as to why, but we suggest that you really shouldn't allow ad hoc charging installations. Again, we'll go through these questions in a moment to give kind of backing as to why we think that, and that should be in favour of a coordinated site-wide approach to EV charging within your building. The related items to this, so how do you manage the fire safety considerations, and also linked to that, how do you mitigate insurance concerns, if there are any? Well, from an ad hoc installation perspective, you can set and should set, we would recommend, clear guidelines or rules to all residents, although in reality it is very difficult to manage the fire safety considerations when you are enabling or allowing residents to follow this ad hoc installation process. And you can see here that actually we kind of quite strongly recommend a ban on ad hoc installations, which I'll come on to in a moment as to why we really do suggest that. And from a coordinated building-wide solution perspective, well, actually you can manage that fire safety and insurance concerns by appointing a competent, qualified and experienced installer. And by experience, we mean not just experience in EV charging installations, but we would always recommend an installation partner that's experienced in installing complex commercial installations, whether that be in apartment buildings or elsewhere. And crucially, from a fire safety and insurance perspective, it's really important to have an ongoing maintenance regime once that site-wide solution is installed. We would strongly suggest that you also want to engage with a third party who is willing to themselves engage with the insurers. So quite often some complex questions from insurers or detailed questions, I should say. So you do want to work with a partner that's willing and able to directly engage with those insurers. To move on to managing the electrical load of your building. So we mentioned one of the questions we quite often get, and I'm sure that you guys are thinking about, is there enough electricity coming into the building, and what happens when 2, 3, 10 chargers are installed? Will there be enough electrical load, and will it start to negatively impact the building itself? So in ad hoc installations, quite honestly, it is almost impossible to manage effectively the electrical load of the building due to those separate electrical networks that I mentioned previously. Of course, also always all installed at different times as well. So as and when residents choose or decide to install their EV charger, then it will be at different times, but crucially on that separate electrical network. So extremely difficult to manage the electrical load. However, if you take that kind of coordinated building-wide approach, then load management capabilities can be installed up front with initial infrastructure, which essentially enables that scalability of EV uptake. So because they're on one single electrical network, the load management and load balancing of the incoming supply can be managed at that coordinated site-wide level. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Another common question, so in these two different solution types, who is paying for the electricity that is used by those EV chargers? So in an ad hoc scenario, usually, not always, but usually everyone is paying for that. And what I mean by that is the ad hoc individual resident installations almost always are installed using an existing communal or landlord meter, because residents are extremely unlikely to engage with an energy supplier and a DNO, so district network operator, to install their own energy meter. So the likelihood is that installation will be coming off of an existing meter, which means that whoever's already paying that bill will continue to pay that bill, just with an increased cost for that EV charging. So whether it be a central bill for, a central meter that maybe controls the lifts and the lights, etc., for the communal areas of the building. Actually, if an EV charger or chargers are installed after that meter, then however that's normally paid, and will continue to be paid that way, which means the likelihood is it will be split via the service charge. And so even those residents who are not charging their vehicles and don't even have an electric vehicle will be charged for the use of that energy. Whereas in a coordinated building-wide approach, almost always it's only the residents who use those chargers that will be paying for electricity, and that's because most coordinated solutions have their own meter installed. And I would suggest that if the business that you're engaged with isn't suggesting doing that, then maybe consider some other options as well, because even if it is a building-wide solution that is installed coming off the communal meter, then it means that you as property managers or asset managers are likely the ones who will have to manage those costs. So even if you have site via data and software who uses those chargers, you will still be paying the bill and then be responsible for recharging those energy costs to residents. So I would suggest that the most efficient way of doing this is working with a partner who does install their own energy meter, and so therefore pays the bill for that electricity used for the EV chargers. And so therefore property managers, freeholders, and the rest of the residents don't have to worry about paying that bill and trying to bear the costs of EV charging. Just one final key consideration on this list, although there are several more that we can always discuss, but who is responsible for ongoing management and maintenance? And I think even if we stopped at the who is responsible element, talk about management and maintenance, but from a safety and a wider perspective, who's responsible for those charge points? Well, in an ad hoc installation perspective, no single party is responsible. So it makes crucial safety and reliability topics difficult to manage. So even though the resident themselves in this scenario would have installed their own EV charge point, as I mentioned, it would likely be off a communal meter within and the cables would be within a communal space, which normally falls within people on this call's responsibility. And of course, as soon as you start adding a second, third, fourth, fifth, individually installed resident charge point, then it becomes pretty complicated and complex as to who's responsible for what, and can also, as I mentioned, have cause issues on the overall electrical load of the building. So very difficult to suggest, and as you guys will know much better than me, if no single party is responsible, it normally means that you guys end up being responsible for it, or certainly from a time and effort perspective, it falls on your plate. Whereas a coordinated building-wide approach, so there are options for this building-wide approach where freeholders or property managers own and manage it, so it could still be falling on your plate, but ultimately it's the party that manages that building-wide infrastructure. So whether it be you guys or freeholders, or you've appointed a third party to install, own and manage that infrastructure, is of course the much easier, safer and less risky and time-consuming option, to appoint a third party who will manage and be responsible for all of that infrastructure. So just to go into a little bit more detail on a couple of these points. So I mentioned earlier that our view as ChargeGuru is that you should consider, I'm not telling you to do that, of course, it's something that you guys will need to think about. But we do think, given the OZEV changes, which I will talk about in a moment, it's really worth considering banning ad hoc kind of individually managed resident-led installations, for all the reasons we discussed. But to summarize that, limited to no control of the installation by yourselves. Ongoing maintenance and safety, as discussed, can have some real concerns and issues from a property management perspective, whether that be reliability or issues around the energy load, or more importantly, around the safety element and fire safety. It's extremely difficult to manage those individually installed charging points, and also, as mentioned, lack of scalability. So without that coordinated approach, it means that actually at some point, even if everything is done extremely well and extremely properly and extremely safely, at some point that will no longer be a scalable solution. So you'll have to tell resident number 6, 7 or 8 with an EV that they cannot install their own charge point, which of course becomes very difficult if you've allowed the first 5 or 6 residents to install their own charge point. So that lack of scalability is important. Now we finally come on to the OZEV grant. It links to everything I've just discussed. Actually, the OZEV grant changed from the 1st of April, and I think this is why it's the topic of today's webinar, and why hopefully it's important for you guys to be aware of this, because it's not something that perhaps you would have been aware of otherwise. That grant change from the 1st of April has actually increased the risk of those unmanaged, uncontrolled, essentially tenant-led EV charger installations. The reason it has increased is because prior to 1st of April, there was, you can see on the left there, a £30,000 per building infrastructure grant available. So as it suggests by the name of it, name the landlord grant. It was, name the landlord infrastructure grant. It was there to enable freeholders, property managers, or third-party EV installer and management companies. It was enable them to sorry, someone's just trying to come into my office to test the fire alarm, but tells them they can't do that right now. It allowed buildings essentially to claim up to £30,000 for the infrastructure costs of EV charging. So everything we're talking about from a coordinated building-wide solution, it enabled the initial costs to set up that infrastructure, enabled a majority of that, up to £30,000, to be claimed by that landlord or property manager. Now, from 1st of April, that is no longer available. That's been removed by the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. And what has changed is prior to the 1st of April, there was also a £350 grant available for individual charge point installations within apartment buildings. That grant has actually increased to £500. So the infrastructure grant has been removed, but the grant per charge point has increased from £350 to £500. So why has that increased the risk? Well, it's done 2 things. One, it's meant that buildings it's not financially viable for the majority of buildings to take this coordinated building-wide approach. We'll talk about funding solutions in a moment, but essentially it means that it's extremely costly. So therefore, it's unlikely that buildings will have, without engaging a third party, it's unlikely that buildings will have that coordinated approach, is the first point. But the second point, which really kind of doubles down on that increased risk of unmanaged, uncontrolled EV charger installations, is the fact that, of course, that resident grant has increased from 350 to 500. So it's essentially incentivizing residents to go and do their own thing. I want to be really clear here that the OZEV guidelines clearly state that they must have permission from freeholder or property manager. But the reality is that's, again, extremely difficult to police from an OZEV grant perspective. And unfortunately, we have seen, working with freeholders, and some of you may well be on the call, that when auditing their portfolio, the reality is residents do their own thing, potentially without you knowing, if there isn't a solution available to them. So we spoke about the significant increase in cost of EV charging. So, at-home charging public charging is 3 times as expensive as charging at home. And if you combine that with the fact that, as we said, almost 10% of all vehicles on the road are now plug-in vehicles, which means the likelihood is if you have an apartment block, then the reality is there's already EVs in that building car park. So by combining those two market factors, 1 in 10 cars on the road are electrified, plus it's 3 times cheaper to charge at home, then the reality is that £500 grant is now incentivizing residents to go and do their own thing, which is why we're saying consider taking action and maybe putting clear guidelines or rules in place for residents just to protect yourselves. And that's why we're considering this. That's why we're suggesting that you consider this in light of the OZEV funding changes. Just a quick point on load balancing. So why is that important? So it enables, as well as from a safety perspective, not safety, as well as from a load management perspective, to ensure that your building does not essentially blow any fuses. So again, if we're coming off a shared communal supply and meter, then there's always the possibility that the electrical load is greater than is available, and so therefore it may stop, may impact the electrical capabilities of the building. So I mentioned communal supply that maybe runs the lifts or the communal area lights. So if it's not done centrally at a coordinated building-wide level, then there's always a possibility that the energy used for EV charging may end up tripping the electricity for that meter. So that is the first point. However, on top of that, why is load balancing important? So it allows the building to optimize its capacity, its electrical capacity. It also enables overnight charging for residents, we'll see in a moment, and it maximizes that scalability potential, which I mentioned previously. So just to quickly give you an idea of what we mean by optimizing the available load and enabling overnight charging. So you can see here, this is from the national grid. So typical summer and winter demands on the national grid. So this is across the whole electrical network of the UK. But of course, most buildings, most houses generally follow this curve. So you can see here that the red line is winter. So of course we have more energy demand in winter to heat our homes, etc. And the blue line is in summer. You can see that there's different kind of minimum and maximum loads. So you can see in winter, it's down at sort of between 35 and 40,000 megawatts, and in summer it's down at that sort of 30,000 megawatts. When actually in peak time, so you can see there sort of 5:30, 6 o'clock when perhaps people get home, maybe put the kettle on, TV on, lights on, then yeah, the load requirement on the grid is significantly more, up at over 55,000 megawatts. So what does that mean? Well, it means there's a 35% difference in winter between the lowest demand and the highest demand, and that increases to 50% in summer. So when we talk about optimizing the available building load and enabling overnight charging, what load management systems within an apartment building are able to do is they are able to use the available energy at times when the building isn't using it. So as you can see here, overnight between midnight, you can see midnight on the far left-hand side here, to around 5:30, 6 o'clock. Actually, there's going to be between generally 35 to 50% available electrical load during that period, which is the perfect time to charge your electric vehicle, of course, whilst you're asleep. You come home from work, you plug in your vehicle, and the load management systems mean that at night, when there perhaps is more electrical load availability within the building, then it enables those residents to charge their vehicles. So that's another reason load balancing is really important, and to optimize that available building load. So if we've been through the kind of the key considerations and between ad hoc installations and coordinated building-wide solutions, and hopefully highlighted some of the reasons as to why we strongly recommend against allowing ad hoc, and why we strongly recommend a coordinated site-wide approach to EV charging. But in light of the OZEV grant funding changes that I just went through, we just wanted to quickly run through some other funding solutions that are available. Maybe this isn't exhaustive, but we've tried to just group it into a few different buckets. So there is freeholder or property management funded options, of course. So funded and managed entirely by the freeholder or property management company. Now, of course, with that £30,000 OZEV grant removed, it is a high cost solution, and of course a high effort solution for whoever's owning or managing that, i.e. people on this call. So clearly, if you don't get a third party involved to manage and own it, then it's quite often a high effort solution, but an option for sure. Leaseholder funded, so essentially funded by leaseholders, whatever that looks like, whether it's RTM, RMC led or potentially service charge led, which is also a little bit difficult sometimes, but ultimately it would still be managed by the freeholder or property manager. Now, the issue here is that there is still that high risk of ad hoc installation. So unless it's that fully coordinated approach to the whole building, then actually allowing your individual residents and leaseholders to fund it themselves, it does encourage ad hoc installations, and as mentioned, ultimately probably still ends up with you guys managing it, even if it's not funded or owned by yourself or freeholder. And the third option is that third party funded and managed option. So yeah, there are third party companies out there, of course we're one of them, but there are others who not only fund the infrastructure, so even in light of the OZEV grant removal, there's, for example, ChargeGuru, as I mentioned, have been doing it for over a decade, and in most of the other countries that we operate, there wasn't that grant funding anyway. So we're used to funding that capital cost up front. So we would fund that, we or another third party would fund that infrastructure up front and then manage that whole solution. And for all the reasons we've discussed, what that enables is that kind of safe site-wide solution that is entirely managed by a third party. And of course, again, as discussed, it enables that scalability of the solution. So just to touch on coordinated EV solutions and perhaps a process timeline, so a rough timeline, and just to caveat this is not definitive, but we just wanted to give an idea of approximate timelines and maybe give you an idea of next steps if you were to decide to take that next step on the EV charging journey within your building or portfolios. So today, if you were to engage with a third party provider like ourselves or another, then of course there's a time period, maybe a couple of weeks, to agree the building agreement, whether that be a lease agreement or a way leave agreement, to enable that third party to install, own and manage EV infrastructure in that building. There's then these kind of survey and feasibility study, which leads on to a DNO approval process. So spoke about the electrical load and ensuring that there's enough electrical load into the building that can then be managed by the third party. And that's where the DNO, the district network operator, is involved. So you need a discussion and approval with those regional DNOs prior to installing EV charging. Then after that approval, the infrastructure installation, and depending on the solution, chargers are then installed on demand. You can see here that the varying timelines, the DNO probably being the most variable and also the longest element of that. So out of ours or your control, but a really important element of it. So again, not set in stone that it will be within 3 to 9 months. Some are a little bit quicker than that from start to finish. Some unfortunately can take longer, depending on that DNO approval process. But what's really important is in terms of who's doing what along this process, although it can be quite a long process. Well, of course, so that's meant to be a little building logo to represent yourselves or the building itself. So of course, you as property experts, owners, managers need to engage with a third party provider, and maybe many of you are at this stage where you haven't engaged yet. Then the building agreement signature is of course a discussion and agreement between the third party and the building itself. So I of course use the ChargeGuru logo there, but it could be any third party. And what's really important is all of the next steps, again using our logo of course, but all of the next steps are or should be managed by that third party. So although this time period can be quite extensive and the number of steps may be a little bit daunting, and even here they're simplified somewhat, the important thing that we're trying to get across here is that a lot of the work can, should and will be done by that third party. So really it's just about engaging those third parties as soon as possible to start the process for your buildings or your building portfolio. So to summarize what we've been through over the last sort of 35 to 40 minutes. So from a market perspective, there are already over 3 million plug-in vehicles on UK roads. And actually something I didn't mention, 500,000 of those have been registered and added to UK roads in the last 6 months. So this continues to increase. As mentioned, the most important piece there for me is the cost parity versus internal combustion engine vehicles. So regardless of regulation and perhaps regardless of local election results as well, actually the cost parity is already here. So regulation aside, EVs are here to stay and going to continue to increase, and are therefore in your car parks already, most likely. From a funding or grant perspective, the £30,000 landlord infrastructure grant has gone. And as mentioned, the resident grant has gone up from 350 to 500. And the other important context around costs and pricing is that it's 3 times cheaper to charge at home. So what does that mean? Well, it means that for the reasons we outlined, that there's an increased risk of those ad hoc installations, which we would suggest are not the right thing to do for all the reasons we've been through. And actually, what we're seeing now and what we're discussing with freeholders, with insurers, and also fire safety experts is that coordinated, maintained, managed charging infrastructure should and is starting to be seen as a risk mitigation, because for all the reasons we've outlined in this session, actually by enabling and providing that EV charging option via a site-wide solution to residents, you significantly reduce the risk of those ad hoc installations. So it's 3 times cheaper to charge at home, but actually if the resident has a coordinated approach from the property manager or the building, then they will go with that approach, is what our data over the last decade suggests. So by having that coordinated approach within the building, you can actually, you're putting in a risk mitigation to stop those residents doing their own thing and potentially causing safety or scalability issues further down the line. And perhaps one call to action or one strong suggestion we would have is start the conversation today. So mention the timeline, but also mention the fact that much of this work and the background work can be done and will be done by a third party such as ourselves. So please do, we encourage you to start the conversation today, so that we can, we or another party can get things moving, assess your portfolio, and hopefully get EV charging correctly and installed on a coordinated basis across your portfolio. So I will now pause and say thank you and say if there's any questions. And before I do, maybe hand back to Vicky, I will also check the Q&A myself, but before I hand back to Vicky to see if there's any open questions, one thing I will say is particularly related to starting the conversation today, maybe I should say start the conversation tomorrow, because if anyone on this session is at the five-a-side event tomorrow that Vicky and the News in the Block team have organised, then we are there as ChargeGuru. And one final request would be, please, if you are in our group, please go easy on us, because I think the last time the majority of us played five-a-side was this time last year at the last News of the Block event. So didn't win a game last year. So if you are there, please feel free to talk about EV charging. More importantly, go easy on us. Over to you.
Fingers crossed, eh? For tomorrow. We have no questions at the moment. I'll just give it a moment in case anyone wants to submit anything now. Otherwise, as Dennis said, if anyone is at the football tomorrow, please feel free to come and speak to him or the team. ChargeGuru are also sponsoring the football, so thanks again for that, Dennis. Just another quick mention. Otherwise, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I hope that was beneficial to everyone. And if you want to get in touch with Dennis after the webinar, please feel free to contact him directly or reach out to me and I can put you in touch. I can't see no questions there, so I guess we can finish up. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Dennis, for your time today, and I will see you all on the next one.
Thank you, Vicky. Thanks all.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.